Hi, before we get started today, I've got some great news, chums. My Gallipoli Evacuation book is now available to pre-order prior to release around early September. Now, this is a new publishing venture, so pre-sales are really important to us. So to tempt you to part with your hard-earned money, if you pre-order now, you get an exclusive behind-the-scenes interview with me that includes lots of excerpts from the interviews I've done and others have done with Gallipoli veterans talking about the evacuation. This is absolutely fantastic. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Now, you can pre-order the book in printed or ebook format at livinghistorytv.com and just follow the links. You can't miss it. You can pay in pounds sterling or Australian dollars. We'll take your money whichever way it comes. Anyway, and now to the podcast. Cheers.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hello, and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History Podcast. This week's episode is all about the air war in 1915. And to help me, to keep me on the straight and narrow, to make sure that my fevered brow is untrammeled, is Gary Bain.
Untrammeled?
It's not scripted, you can tell. I got lost there.
I'd really like to tremble all over your head, Peter.
I think Matt might cut that bit out. Anyway, so what we talked before, didn't we, Gary, about the air war in 1914, and it's a stroke of genius, really, that I thought to do 1915 next. I expect you're filled with admiration for my sausage, so to speak.
I'm filled with love for you and your sausage.
Crikey. I think we'll move on. The listeners will be reaching for their sick buckets again. So let's get on with talking about the air war. Let's just quickly set the scene. In 1914, the armies have disappeared into their trenches up and down the Western Front from end to end. It's not just tentative scrapings now; it's an unbroken trench system, still narrow. In other words, not sort of triple line systems and redoubts and the rest of it, but it is a trench system from end to end. When the war had started, the Royal Flying Corps is mainly concerned with reconnaissance, but after the Aisne, the trenches were dug on the Aisne in September 14, they began to take on new roles. And let's just look at how those progressed from September 1914 through into 1915. I think the first one, Gary, would be the most important thing, and I know you think this as well, is artillery observation. That's the thing. But there's one thing holding them back on wireless observation. What do you think that might be?
Well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, I think originally they went out with very few aircraft, about 65 aircraft, I think. And the biggest problem was that they couldn't carry any weight. We said when we were talking about Air War 1914, it was just about 11 years since flight had been invented. So the machines were very underpowered, sort of 75 to 90 mile an hour in terms of their speeds. And so they couldn't carry anything. So that was the biggest drawback because, I think I touched on it in the first podcast. You want to be able to take photographs, for example. Well, you can't because you can't carry the camera.
It's all difficult, isn't it? Now, things move on though. The aircraft are increasingly more powerful, but they're also, this warfare is a catalyst for change. The need is defined, and then they work on it. Practical men, scientists, just everybody works on it. And the Sterling wireless set only weighs about 20 pounds. Now, £20.
20 pounds? 20 pounds?
It's not like this should show my age. It's not like the transistor radios that those nice Japanese people made for us in the 1960s. We all thought were unbelievable. They've moved on a bit. Now everything's in my mobile phone. Everything's in the mobile phone. But then that by the way, that Sterling wireless set is just a transmitter. And did you have a granny? Or sorry?
Yeah. I'm thinking, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the radiogram in my nan's lounge, which was, about the size of my house, actually.
Were you allowed in your nan's lounge? I wasn't allowed in my nan's lounge.
So, yeah, I mean, they were huge things. And that clearly was in the sort of 1960s. So,
yeah.
Christ, I mean, £20.
Well, that meant that they could only get a transmitter up. They could not get a receiver up, which means it's one-way communication, which, of course, makes things... If you're trying to talk to the battery, you can talk to them, but they cannot talk to you. So it's a one-sided means of communication, unless they use their brains. And here again, you have a defined need, and people work at it, Gary. Can I call you Gazza, by the way?
No, Gary's fine.
Okay, Gaz. And what they do is some really bright people develop a clock code. This is always a nightmare to explain, but basically the target, if you consider the target to be at the junction of the hands, i.e. the middly bit, 12 o'clock always pointed true north, and they put this on a map. It always points true north, and from this starting position you can give the relative position of each shot to the gunners on the ground from the observer in the sky. Now here's Captain Archibald James of 16 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. Now Archibald James is one of my favourites. I must tell this story, Gary, because he's a bit of a pompous arse. And one great thing about veterans is they're not all wonderful human beings. Some of them are really annoying. And Archibald James was pompous beyond belief. And he did an interview with my boss, David Lance, at the War Museum. And he was also pompous beyond belief, Gary. And the two of them had these fiery exchanges of correspondence until eventually our transcription typist, Paddy, wrote to him a letter asking a question. And he said, in the reply, which he knew was going to an underling of David's, "The idiot with the tape recorder." And Paddy accidentally stuck this on the notice board of the main notice board of the IWM with yellow, helpfully outlined. And I saw it and I thought it was hilarious. But the other thing I thought was hilarious was that it was my ambition then to be, guess what, Gary? Guess what my ambition was?
I'm surprised you had any ambition, Peter.
It was to be the idiot with the tape recorder. And Gary, I was. For 40 years, man and boy, I was an idiot with a tape recorder. Well, 35 years by the time I got to be a recorder, 36 years. So I was the idiot with the tape recorder. Anyway, I have slightly drifted. People say, are these scripted, Pete?
And just to point out to the dear listeners, you've got 40 years' experience of using a tape recorder. I had to remind you to put the microphone on this morning.
Oh, bollocks! Is it still there, Gary?
Yeah, it's still there.
Now, so this is Captain Archibald James, that wonderful old man, 16 Squadron. What you got to say, Archibald?
So the system of correcting faults was this. You had imaginary circles drawn around the target. 25 yards, 50 yards, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350 and 400. And you had a simple letter and figure code to indicate two things. The clock face point at which the shells were falling. In other words, whether they were falling at 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock from the target, and the distance as expressed in the imaginary circles, which you visualised without much difficulty. With a good battery, you should get them right on target at around about the third salvo.
Now, that's a good battery, and one thing is that there was at the early days there were problems. Now, why would there be a problem with a young, very junior second lieutenant in the back of in the front actually of a B2C, sending back corrections? Why might that be a problem to a crusty old major like for instance Major Chris Carling?
Well, they're not going to like taking that. The batteries are not going to want to be told what to do from the young person in the air. But there's also the fact, it struck me they're using imaginary distances, and they're trying to communicate that to a crusty old artilleryman on the floor. I don't think that went particularly well on occasion.
It took them a while, and there are reports of artillery batteries not really being interested in what they've got. And there is there's a learning process. In some ways, you can't even blame crusty old majors, for being a bit. Well, I've been to Woolwich. I've done my gunnery, and bloody second lieutenant jerk sending me these. Anyway. Now, let's look at the other thing. You mentioned it, and that's photography. And that, the first photographs of over the Ain are pretty blurred, Gary. I've seen them at the War Museum, although I can't remember when. But once once the idea's taken hold, the scientists, everybody else works on it. So, they get they work out the right sort of camera, which, of course, is a big bugger, again, heavy. But they work out the practical necessities of the lens, the focal sausage, whatever it is. I don't no idea how it all works, and fitting it to the aircraft. Do you put it at the bottom of the aircraft, poking through? Well, if you do, you can't see what you're photographing. So they strap it to the side. It's a bit of a strap-on, something you might be familiar with. Why are you shaking your head, Gary? Strapped to the side. I can't see anything wrong with that. And within months, they could get pin-sharp plates. Really, they could.
That's the other thing worth pointing out. These are glass plates being used, aren't they? So they've got to change them
after every photograph.
Yeah. So again, the practicalities of doing that, and of course, you to use your parlance, you've now got a strap on at the side of the aircraft. So all the weight now is to one side. So you've got to compensate for that. And so the practicalities of the technology at the time must have been really quite daunting to overcome.
And even when you get the photographs back, the glass negatives back, you have to have a system in place to actually get them developed and then disseminated to everyone who needs it, every headquarters, every unit, and the rest of it. And we've seen, again, with you can do something. There's been examples in the recent pandemic. You can decide you want to do something, but if the system, the infrastructure isn't in place, then how do you quickly do it? But something else has happened. You've got this picture. What's the picture mean?
Yeah. And have you got the skill set to understand what it means? Nowadays there's a whole science around photographic interpretation.
There is, and from the air you can see things like if people and I always say if people walk across the South Downs in ancient times, then thousands of years ago, even if there's a regular track, you can see it from the air. You can see things from the air, and using concave and the other thing, concave and convex. If you could see that from the air by the way the light falls, you can work out where headquarters are, machine gun posts. You can see barbed wire. You can see dugouts. You can see headquarters. Why can you see headquarters? Because you have to bury the telephone lines. Burying the telephone lines means a ditch before you fill it in, because they bury them 3, 4, 5, 6 feet deep. And you could see that. You could see most of all gun batteries, because they are really obvious. Not just the gun itself, but the dugout, the ammunition store, but crucially, even the tracks where they come in to the battery form a distinctive circle. And you could see it all from the air. Now, let's go back to Archibald James, who's got another quote. And this is the picture you were talking about. This is the practical difficulties of being in the air taking photographs. Go, Mr. Archibald James, or
Lieutenant Archibald James. We used a big, heavy, clumsy box camera. You exposed the prints by pulling a slide away and changed them by hand. You had the camera on your knee.
It's early days.
And on either side of your cockpit, you had a little canvas bag. You yelled at the pilot when you were going to take a photograph, so he kept the machine quite level and didn't tilt the angle of the camera. One took photographs through a circular hole cut in the floor. It was quite a difficult job because, first of all, you had to look through the hole to see the target you were photographing.
So again, it's not scripted. We should have had this quote earlier, because obviously this is the problems that they overcame by strapping it to the side. So there you go. We are idiots, but we can't help ourselves.
Well, one of us is.
Yeah, one of us is, yeah. So using this, they also began to produce photographic maps. So what you do is you link together all the maps to form a mosaic, all the photographs to form a mosaic above the front. And if you can think of it, each photograph is a square, well, oblongy square, and then they all link together. You can piece them together to form a map. And then you can trace them onto the maps you have, the 1-8000, 1-5000 maps.
And presumably you fly, missions, regular missions, because you're looking for changes then. So, troop build-ups, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, the thing, that's further back as well, the long-range aspect. Yeah, long-range reconnaissance becomes more interesting because when you've got a frozen front, one of the ways of telling what's going to happen in the future is to chart or monitor German troop movements at the military centre. So roads, railways, you can see a division arriving. It's a big job, not just, one railway, one train. It's a lot of trains. You can see new camps. You can see supply dumps. You can see aircraft. You can see they start to put in later in the war light railways. But the point remains, you can see things coming. So long-range reconnaissance becomes more important. Now, let's move on to the first real test of these new roles of the Royal Flying Corps. And I would say, to be honest, that's the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, which commences on the 10th of March 1915. It's a first British real attempt to break out of the sort of straitjacket of trench warfare. I think it only fair to point out, in view of our both of our belief, the French have been battering away at the German lines ever since December 1914. But we join in with their offensive on the 10th of March. And the first attack, this attack is made by 1st Army, commanded by, you've heard of him, I expect, General Sir Douglas Haig. And he liaised closely with the man who commanded 1st Wing, which was attached to 1st Army. You can tell why. And that's Lieutenant Colonel Sir Hugh Trenchard.
Sorry, he was only a lieutenant colonel in 1915.
That's right. We think of him as being a major general or a bigwig, but that is that he gets rapid promotion in the war. That's just the way it is. Now, Trenchard left an account of a briefing meeting held with Haig on the 16th of February. So that's going to be me. So I'm going to read this. And he said, I tried to explain what I thought they, by they means the aeroplanes, would do in future besides reconnaissance work. He was interested. Then he said he was going to tell me something only 3 or 4 people in the world yet knew. In March, we were to launch an attack on the Germans. I was not to tell anybody. He said, well, Trenchard, I shall expect you to tell me before the attack whether you can fly, because on your being able to observe the artillery and carry out reconnaissance, the battle will partly depend. If you can't fly because of the weather, I shall probably put off the attack. Well, I'm not sure about that. I think he's gilding the lily a bit. Well, I don't know how real. But the point is, that's Haig encouraging him, making sure that Trenchard knows that the work of the Royal Flying Corps is much appreciated.
And it's also worth noting that, the weather could disrupt the operations quite considerably.
They could, and for air operations, of course, you just can't fly those somewhat flimsy aircraft in bad weather at all. This lasts until 1916, 17, through almost the end of the war. Bad weather reduces flying. It also marks the start of an association between Haig and Trenchard that would endure for the whole war. By now, from now on, air operations are fundamental, Gary, to every major offensive. They are right at the heart of the planning. That reconnaissance and artillery observation, long-distance reconnaissance, short-range photographic reconnaissance, and later on there'll be hundreds of what they called core aircraft engaged on these missions. And
did those core aircraft have a means of defending themselves? Were they, at this point, fitted with any sort of
not usually.
Armaments?
Not usually, and that's a great point, Gary, because that's going to be part of the story of 1915, as gradually how they build up, how they need to defend themselves, because there starts to be a whole new class of aircraft called scouts, or fighters to young people today. Now, during the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the Royal Flying Corps carries out its roles. It produces a detailed map, the first detailed map revealing the whole German trench system. And that is given to everybody at the front. All the units going over, the officers, obviously, the units going over the top, identifying key targets, and they were involved in the preliminary bombardment to register and destroy all identified German batteries. They also attempted interdiction bombing attacks against German railheads to try and stop reinforcements coming forward. How do you think that went?
Well, I'm assuming it was unsuccessful. Bombing...
What? Why?
Well, what was the size of the bombs from these flimsy aircraft?
What else? The size of the bombs? What about...
Well, the people on the ground are going to be firing at you. I'm assuming the Germans
That's going to put you off.
Step back and say, oh, look, there's a nice little aircraft up there.
They're going to shoot at you. And, of course, a big thing is, of course, the bomb sites. They're Heath Robinson. They're completely useless.
And I presume the aircraft are relatively low.
Yeah, yes.
So susceptible to all sorts of fire from the ground.
One of the big problems at Neuve-Chapelle battle was command and control, and a new job was given because the fog of war drops. The telephone lines are cut to the front. Generals can't tell what's happening, and they developed something called contact patrols. And contact patrols are to monitor the progress of the infantry on the ground so that the headquarters can sort of deploy more troops, increase the artillery support, that kind of thing. And an early attempt was at the Second Battle of Ypres, which starts when the Germans attack us on 22nd of April 1915. Those Germans are jolly rough types at times, Gary, especially in the First and Second World War. They were desperate to try and fix the location of where the British and German lines were, and the French, of course, because they're at Ypres as ever, or not as ever, but at that time. And Captain Lano Hawker carries out a contact patrol on the 25th of April over Langemarck. Now, he suffers this problem. And this quote that you're going to read, no, it's me. I'm Lano Hawker. Hooray, I like being Lano Hawker. He's one of my heroes. And he finds out from bitter experience it's difficult to tell what's happening on the ground. So this is what he says. I had a very careful look at that bit of ground, circling and going over it again and again until I could make sure of the exact positions we held. It was while flying low over a big farm to the north of this bit that I received a bullet just above my left ankle. And that solved the problem as to who held the farm. He's a brave chap.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably touch on him later, but arguably our first air race, Lano Hawker.
Yeah, very much so. One of just an inspirational First World War figure in the air war in 1915-16. Now, they then try and use other things. And at the Battle of Ober's Ridge on 9th of May, because that's no good, you can't fly low and see who shoots at you, because for a start, the Durham Light Infantry shoot at everybody in the air. That's long been their principle. A fine body of men, the Durham Light Infantry. In Battle of Ober's Ridge, the contact patrols had a wireless on board the aircraft, and they were looking for white linen slips which would be laid out by the infantry on the ground. And here we have one of the people who did it. They report back to First Wing headquarters, and one of them was Captain Archibald James. So here you go again.
It had been arranged that in order to let the air see how far they'd got, the most advanced troops would from time to time put out white strips of cloth about 8 feet long and a foot wide. I'm just going to pause there. 8 feet long and a foot wide. To my astonishment, when I arrived with almost the first light, the whole of the battlefront was covered with white strips. What in fact had happened was that the methodical Germans had lined their trenches with wooden boards, and our bombardment, when it hit a trench, blew out a number of planks which scattered round and were quite indistinguishable from the white strips the troops were supposed to have put out.
And do you know what? This is just an ongoing problem. One scheme had sort of umbrellas. They put triangles on the back of famously on the back of the 29th Division to try and make it visible from observers on the ground, in the air. They try, but in the end, it's always still Mark 1 eyeball. You've got to fly low and have a look. It never really changes in the First World War because it just can't.
Yeah, and that, I mean, the size of those strips sort of accentuates the problem, doesn't it? You're not just putting down a sheet of paper for them to see. 8-foot long strip to say it can be seen.
Well, my favourite is, you imagine yourself surrounded by, you just managed to get into the German frontline trench, and there they are, there's still Germans about. Oh, I'll just put out this 8-foot.
Yeah. Hang on a minute.
At the Battle of the Somme, they had little flares to light. Now, can you imagine lighting the flare? You're in the German frontline trench, lighting those flares. And the Germans say, hang on, there's a flare going off over there. Let's go and kill him. So they didn't, being infantry. They only do what they want. Now, I think it's about time to talk about that all these things are being developed. And it's a natural break in the offensives after Oberstridge and Festubert. So let's talk about the expansion of the Royal Flying Corps. And one of those things is we've got to talk about the aircraft, Gary. And you mentioned this. Now, you're familiar with the whole concept. When you were a commercial director for Transport for London, you were involved with some of these things. And the idea of changing a major sort of item takes a long time. Now, they'd settled on the BE-2 series of aircraft, which had been developed by the Royal Aircraft Factory, i.e. by the government. It was nationalised.
Just to be clear, BE stands for Baleario Experimental. Another wonderful name for an aircraft.
Well, it is, especially when you get the Baleario Experimental Mark II Variant C. I mean, so much better than Spitfire or Hurricane. Those are names for children. A real man wants to fly in a Baleario Experimental Mark II Variant C.
Yeah. But the BE-2 wasn't new, was it? I think it had first been introduced to the RFC in 1912, so it wasn't a new aircraft.
No, it was a two-seater. By this time, the C version had a 90 horsepower engine, and that
90 horsepower.
Like your lawnmower, Gary, for the estate. It meant that it could carry more load, hence it could get the cameras up, it could get the wireless up. But the problem is, you set on it, and why do they have to set on it? Because they can't make them all at the Royal Aircraft Factory. So they commission. And I always like the thought they commissioned bicycle factories, they commissioned Walnut. Everybody in the country who could build these aircraft to this plan were commissioned to build them. And this is very efficient in one sense because you get a lot. A lot of them are built, which is what to meet the demand. But it also fixes it because you can't change the contracts because all these things will go out of business.
Yeah, a modern example of that would be the railways and hospitals that were built by PFIs. And from my own experience, once you're locked in, you're locked in. Yeah.
The other thing is that aircraft design isn't something you can change quickly. If you want a new tube train, you can't say, I'd like a new tube train, and can we have it next year? Now, with an aircraft, you might just about get away with next year in 1915. Actually, it's all built around the engine. There's development work. There's everything. It takes a long time. And decisions made in 15 meant that they were still flying BE-2 variants. It got up to H, I think, in 1917. Still the same aircraft.
But it was built to fulfil a need, wasn't it? It's described as a very stable aircraft. Presumably because you want a stable aircraft for the reconnaissance role and the photographing. But, as things develop, having a stable aircraft perhaps was not best. Best as things developed through 1915.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to... So you've got these aircraft. Let's look at it from the British perspective. The same thing's happening with the Germans. You've got these observation aircraft, these BE-2s, and you've got to shoot them down. The Germans have to shoot them down. And a couple of things. First thing, it had started in 14, but things get better. Anti-aircraft guns get more efficient. Gunners get more skillful as they realise what they have to do. You have to shoot a certain distance ahead at a certain height. Everything starts to work it out. Anti-aircraft shells are always... Remember we talked about... it was called Archie. Archibald? Certainly not! Where it came from. And here's... both of our heroes. It's along with Manic in 1917. He's one of my all-time heroes. Corporal James McCudden, 3 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. And you're going to read this quote, aren't you, Gary?
I heard a crump, then another and another, and looking above me saw several balls of white smoke floating away. The pilot turned to mislead Archie, of whom I was having my first bad experience. However, I can honestly say that I did not feel any more than a certain curiosity as to where the next one was going to burst. Watching these shells burst, they were mostly shrapnel then. The shrapnel bullets each left a thin, fine line of smoke, so that as each shell burst, the shrapnel came from each burst in the shape of a fan.
Now, there's two things I'd draw to your attention there. Well, no. One, you can see these shells, and that's very, The other is, this person is not normal. I love the line. I can honestly feel that I did not feel any more than a certain curiosity. And this is a sign of the man, completely cold, not cold, just almost detached, able to look at things, no fear, amazing. Now, I'm going to read one, certainly more like us, although this is another brave officer, Second Lieutenant Duncan Grinnell Milne, 16 Squadron. And he is more normal. And he says this. He's under, what do you do when you're under Archie fire? He says this. How often did one turn? How long did one wait after turning? And then what? Did one alter one's height just after a shell had burst, or just before? After might be too late. But how did one know when was just before? I love that. I wondered if I ought not to try everything at once just to be on the safe side. And I love that even more. You can tell, what should I do? Because there's a shell burst to your left, if you turn right, then the gunners might have corrected. You might run straight into it. If you go straight on, the guns might have really corrected. Okay, what do you do? It's amazing,
And at this stage, with the aircraft capable of flying above the artillery,
but if you do, you can't carry out your photographic reconnaissance or your artillery observation. So do you see what I mean? They're limited. Also, the height restrictions. They couldn't get very high.
I've often suffered from height restrictions myself.
Yes, well, that's your duck's leg disease. We've not really talked about your duck, so we've mainly concentrated on your weight. Now, I'm delighted to tell the listeners that Gary has now commenced the diet that I've long been advocating, and he's losing weight hand over fist. But now, the next thing we're going to work on improving about his whole body is his duck's leg. You want to talk about your duck's legs?
No, I think we'll talk about the air war in 1915, Peter.
Are you sure? What's that gesture mean? Anyway, so the numbers of anti-aircraft guns, they're not only getting more efficient, there's more and more of them. And you get what they describe as a sort of wall of shell bursts in front of you. And, and of course, our generation look at the Second World War and the flights over Germany, and it's not like that, but it's still scary to most people. Now, the second method of getting rid of these core aircraft, these aircraft do artillery observation and reconnaissance, is to shoot them down. Now, in 14, they just couldn't get the guns, not even a Lewis gun up. But by now, they just couldn't get them up. And very early 15, it goes on. And here's another quote. They took up what weapons they could. Now, these range from hand grenades, or bombs as they call them, rifles, shotguns, revolvers. Revolvers just a joke, but yeah, they took these up. Anything before they could get the proper machine gun up. And you're Lieutenant Archibald James again, aren't you, Gary?
Yeah. So he says, I had been a very good rifle shot all my life. I was very confident of my marksmanship. We met a German aircraft about the same altitude and speed as ourselves, so that we couldn't get any closer than, say, 600 yards. I put my sights on the service rifle to the 600 yards and fired 6 deliberate shots, and was miserable that I didn't hit him at all. I've no doubt I was miles away. We had no conception then at what close ranges was necessary to shoot to have any effect at all.
Yeah, we're talking 50, 100 yards. They got as close as they could later on, and that's with a machine gun, when they could get them up. First 6 of the months of the war, they can't really get many. Most aircraft can carry out their functions without airborne interference. But again, we've got the, war is the mother of invention, and soon they begin to gun up aircraft. Now, Scout aircraft is what these aircraft would be called. Fighters would be called. Now, originally, they were scouts. This is where the name came from. They were meant to go ahead of the BEF, and they were meant to just go there fast, the rest of it. And they were meant to try and shoot down German reconnaissance or artillery observation once they'd realised that these aircraft were powerful enough to take up a machine gun. Do you see what I mean? Now, the one that is most linked with this development is the Bristol Scout. Now, that was quite fast. So you're going to laugh because it's as fast as your mini metro or whatever it is you drive. It goes at 80 miles per hour. That's all it goes at. But that was fast then, and it could get up a Lewis gun, you know. And this, you know. However, there's a problem. You've got this Lewis gun. What's the problem, Gary?
Well, if it's a tractor, which is pulling from the front, it's got to go through the propeller. The propeller's in front of you.
If you want to fix it to the front of the aircraft, and then, like a car, you aim the machine gun by aiming the aircraft, like you aim between a gap between traffic, you know. So if you want to aim the machine gun, well, how'd you do it? And the first solution was Captain Lano Hawker. He had a Bristol Scout, and what he did, and it's so simple, was he fixed a Lewis gun, and he fixed it at an angle, you know, so that it was strapped to the fuselage but cocked off to the left, so that it fired past the propeller obliquely, you know. Now that. Aiming's hard enough in an airplane anyway, because you've got to allow for deflection for the other aircraft. But can you imagine how difficult it was? And you've got a quote from Hawker. I've got a quote from Hawker. Why do I keep thinking you're Hawker? I think it's your natural good looks and air of authority. And he said this, although I don't want to be mean-spirited about it. He says this about an air fight over Ypres, the 25th of July. Climbed to 11,000 feet. At about 7 p.m., saw a hostile machine being fired at by anti-aircraft guns at about 10,000 feet over Hooge. Approached down sun. Hey, you can't see out of the sun because of the sunlight in your eyes. And opened fire at about 100 yards range. The hostile machine burst into flames, turned upside down and crashed east of Zillebek. This guy is super skilled. Not only the brains and ingenuity to fix the gun to the machine, but he could also have the natural skill and shooting ability to not only allow for deflection, but to allow for the fact that it's skewed off at 20 degrees to the left. Amazing.
And he shoots down, I think he shoots down another aircraft that day, doesn't he? And is he awarded the VC for his actions?
He does get a VC. It's what they call a soft VC in one sense, but his actions later on in the war more than, you know, in my view, justify it. But at the time, it's, you know, he shoots down a couple of aircraft, gets awarded the VC. Now, there are other solutions. One of the solutions is to put it on the top wing, and that's a variant, but that doesn't really come into play just yet. The other one is to use your pusher aircraft. Now, pusher, you mentioned tractor. Tractor's got the propeller in front. Pusher's got the engine and the propeller behind. I've no idea how it works, but one thing to bear in mind when we're talking about it being primitive is that jet engines are pushers. Which people often forget. And this means that you've got a little cockpit in front. You've got the pilot, you know, at the back, and then in front of him is the observer. Now that observer can have a Lewis gun, and he can shoot anywhere in front of him. So he has a completely free area of fire. So, you know, it's a really good idea. And the first purpose-built British Scout would be the Vickers Fighter. And I know David Lance called it a Vickers Fighter and was told by Archibald James that this was a plebeian term. He's a wonderful man. It's a biplane pusher, and it starts to arrive on the Western Front in about February 1915, you know. And the first, they used to have, and a squadron used to be any machine, different types. But the 11 Squadron, which arrives in July 15, is the first aircraft squadron built of just one aircraft. They're solely equipped with Vickers fighters, and they make an impact. The Vickers Fighter does. So let's just look at here's one quote. This is from a bit earlier, 10th of May. A Vickers, it's armed with a Lewis gun and a rifle, and they encounter a German aircraft. And the Vickers piloted by you, Gary, Lieutenant W.H.D. Ackland, 5th Squadron. Tell me what happens, Mr. W.
We caught him up and opened fire from above and behind at about 50 yards. The pilot was hit and the machine also, as I saw flakes of material flying off. They dived and we followed, and the observer fired with his pistol but did little damage. I saw the observer then drop his arm as if he was hit. The machine then nosedived from about 1,500 feet, turned on her back and fell to the ground.
So there you go. I mean, what you've got a machine gun and they're firing with a pistol. You know, it's you know, but
we've had this discussion before, Peter, about, you know, how the advances in technology put either side in the ascendancy for periods of time, and I'm sure we'll come on to periods where the Germans are in ascendancy.
We will indeed. For instance, the Vickers Fighter is only really a good, if you like, powerful opponent for a couple of months. Already they had vastly superior FE2B, that's another two-seater coming along, and then there's a single-seater DH2 which would have a fixed Lewis for the pilot, single-seater. But something else is happening, and this is Roland Garros has fitted deflector plates to the propeller of his Marine Saulnier. It's a Parasol monoplane. And this allowed him to fire straight through the propeller. And when I say straight through the propeller, it had deflector plates.
So
yes, Gary, why are you laughing?
Well, I'm just thinking a deflector could deflect anywhere.
Yeah, it could deflect anywhere. It also... I mean, the vibration, you know, a machine gun bullet hitting a propeller, even though it hits the metal plate. Now, you ought to realise, of course, most of it's air, if you like, that, you know, not many bullets would hit it, but they would. Anyway, he has some success. He shoots down 3 or 4, I can't remember which, German aircraft. And then his aircraft mysteriously crashes. I wonder what could have caused that behind German lines. The Germans look at it and they get a Dutch bloke working for a Dutch aircraft designer and manufacturer to have a look at this. And I love the concept of this professional aircraft designer looking at this mad idea and going, they want him to invent something. And you can imagine going, sod that for a game of soldiers. That is ludicrous. And he takes up an interrupter system, which is a sort of complex thing, which means that the machine gun would only fire when the propeller wasn't there. And God knows how it works. It's very complicated. And it's an interrupter gear. There you go. And he fits it to the Fokker Eindecker 1. Now, this has been a gift to aviation historians ever since, because the Fokker has led to a few jokes, Gary. I know you can't. I mean, you're looking serious now. I can see you through your Zoom camera.
Well, I've obviously got it wrong, because I always use the word Eindecker in the jokes.
Yes, Gary, you would. Now, it is another. It's very similar to the Marine Saulnier. It's a Parasol monoplane. What's good about it? Well, what's good about it? It's good at diving, and it's got a machine gun firing through the propeller, so it can dive down and shoot at things in front of it. You aim the machine gun by aiming the aircraft. They sent out, and there's not many of them at first, and there's some teething problems. You know, there's always teething problems in new aircraft, and they sort of disappear. They're withdrawn for safety checks. They appear in the sort of summer of 15, then disappear, and they come back in September. Now, meanwhile, the Hugh Trenchard is promoted to brigadier and given command of the RFC on the Western Front. He goes with Haig in some ways. As Haig gets more and more highly thought of, he gets, you know, and he has an unswerving belief, Trenchard, that the Royal Flying Corps is entirely subordinate to the requirements of the army. They've got to do whatever's required. They've got to do it, whatever the losses that occur. And in this, he's entirely right. This is what the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, the British Army expect. They are not a separate air service. They are a corps. They are part of the army. And they don't just expect it. They demand that the Royal Flying Corps carry out reconnaissance, artillery recon, all their other functions in any offensive. The next big one is, guess what?
Loos, I would imagine.
The Battle of Loos, which is launched on the 25th of September. Now, and the first wing, RFC, is once again Douglas Haig's army, First Army, and they're supporting them. By this time, the cameras are firmly strapped on to the side of the aircraft. They've got a simplified mechanism that changes and stores the glass plate mechanism. Photographic interpretations improved. They've got a better system of aerial observation. The clock code is used and understood. The artillery now accept it for the most part. They've developed a sort of zone call, a JJ call, which can call an emergency response onto a specific map square. That means just everybody near fires at a square. It's not accurate, but if, for instance, there's a battery in that square or a division or German counterattack coming, it's useful. And they've got box kites by this time, which we won't mention much, but box kite balloons, they just, what's their great advantage?
Well, they're fixed, so they can look at you all the time.
They don't have to come down after half an hour or an hour. So, and you know, the only problem is in a sense, they could suppress German fire because the Germans wouldn't fire while they're up there. So they're useful, they're at it. But, you know, the contact patrols still aren't working, and the Battle of Loos is not a success. But the Royal Flying Corps performs its functions. But what did we say about September? The Fokkers are coming. And the Fokkers do come. People often talk about two young pilots. Now, you've probably... this is a good test. Have you heard of the two most famous Fokker pilots of the time?
Well, as we've recently did a podcast with our friends at Hack History, I presume you're talking about Bolker and Immelman.
Oswald Bolker, Max Immelman, yeah. Two German new aces. The ace, by the way, is
I didn't know they were German.
It's right. And they have
I put you off, Peter?
Yeah, probably. But an ace was someone who had claimed, and it was accepted, that they'd shot 5 enemy aircraft down.
That's very few. 5?
Yeah. Well, remember, Hawker got the VC, but essentially for shooting down 2. So, you know. Now, they developed, particularly Bolker, but also Immelman, the language of aerial fighting. So perhaps you could... I know you did the dicta, as Bolker later on called it. So what sort of things are we talking about, Gary? Tell us.
Well, so, you know, they would be high, hanging around high, looking down on the victim, for want of a better word. They would always attack from above, from behind. The idea was for your victim to be helpless, so come out of the sun.
Why out of the sun?
Well, because you can't see. If you look at the sun, you're blinded. Make sure that they were at sufficient height so that they could dive. You know, they wanted to use the Fokker to its best attributes, and one of its best attributes was the fact that it could dive at speed and fire, and then sweep away and turn away and you know, get away from any return fire.
Well, that's spot on. And hit or miss, they could if they needed to, they could escape, and if not, they could turn back round and finish you off. Now, there's a quote here from Max Immelman, and he's attacking a Vickers Fighter, which is that had dominated the battlefield for a couple of months, but now this one's piloted by Captain Darley with an observer, Second Lieutenant Slade. So what happens? Well, unfortunately, it's Max Immelman telling the tale. Come on, Max.
I took up the pursuit, hiding behind his tail all the time. My fingers were itching to shoot, but I controlled myself and withheld my fire until I was within 60 metres of him. I could plainly see the observer in the front seat, peering out downward. Knack, 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 went my gun.
Knack, knack, knack. Surely it's dagger, dagger, dagger.
Well, I think we've discovered the machine guns make very different sounds depending on which side you're on. Knack, knack, knack went my gun. 50 rounds, and then a long flame shot out of his engine. Another 50 rounds at the pilot. Now his fate was sealed. He went down in long spirals to land. Almost every bullet of my first series went home. Elevator, rudder, wings, engine, tank and control wires were shot up. The pilot had a bullet in the right upper arm. I also shot his right thumb away. The machine had received 40 hits. The observer was unwounded. His machine gun was in perfect working order, but he had not fired a single shot. So complete was the surprise I sprung on him.
Now, this is it. I mean, diving down, and he has, I should have mentioned this, he has a machine gun, a Maxim. Not a Lewis with the limitations of the small drum with about 40 rounds. This is a machine gun with a belt, Now, there's not much. They've only got a few seconds. But the surprise. Notice how I'm pleased to say that these two chaps escaped relatively unscathed. But often the first time you know that someone like Immelman or Bolker's behind you is when the bullets tear through you. And you only know it for as long as it takes you to die.
Yeah, I mean, it's not very Night of the Skies, is it? There's this romantic vision of the scouts and the fighter pilots of being Knights of the Sky. I mean, that's ruthless.
Ruthless, murderous. They're doing it for their country. All war is, in one sense, murderous. They're not murderous people, but they are carrying out murderous actions on behalf of their country. There's no mercy. They're just shooting. He basically tries to shoot the aircraft up. He tries to kill them. He's probably pleased they're alive when they land, but the thing is, he must get them. But they could have had photographs. If it was a reconnaissance aircraft, they could have had photographs that could cause the deaths of hundreds of Germans. That's the point. You've got to dash the aircraft from the sky. Now, the Vickers is...
It's worth pointing out here that I think that demonstrates perfectly my point about technology. That's a massive advance in technology, and it puts the advantage clearly with the Germans.
It does. And you get things like the Immelman term. And I used to do a demonstration of this in a talk because it's a half roll off a half loop. I used to do it with my arm. I used to almost dislocate my bloody shoulder. Don't try it at home, children. The Fokkers would hunt in threes, and the leader would make the attack, protected by the other two. This is standard fighter attack things. If you try and kill the same target, you'll fly into each other. And this exposes the weakness of the BE-2C, which most of them were at least, that variant. Because the observer's in the front cockpit. And he's surrounded by sticky things and stringy bits, wires, which you're best not to shoot away. So he's got his Lewis gun, and he's surrounded by, things. If he shoots them away, they'll crash. And it's dreadfully difficult, But what are they going to do instead? What else can they fly? The army are insisting that the reconnaissance be carried out. They can't wait. So they've got to carry it. What are you going to fly? Well, you're going to fly BE-2Cs. And for the rest of 15, the rest of 16, and through to about April 17, they have to carry on flying the BE-2s. Meanwhile, the Fokker's slightly upgraded to E2 and E3 models. The Germans seem to be good. And the idea spreads of a Fokker scourge. Now, there's not that many Fokkers. And in reality, there's not that many RFC casualties. But they're difficult to replace. You train a pilot for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. They're shot down in seconds. It takes months to replace them. Now Trenchard realised he had to maintain morale. And he does his best to improve morale and replace squadron casualties. He says this: I always looked on the RFC as a family. I tried to put myself in the others' places and to consider the feelings of those who flew as if they'd been my own. If, as an ordinary pilot, you see no vacant places around you, the tendency is to brood less on the fate of friends who have gone forever. Instead, your mind is taken up with buying drinks for the newcomers and making them feel at home. It was a matter of pride and human understandings. But it's quite murderous, and it takes some courage for Trenchard to maintain this aggressive posture, doesn't it? What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, it's a moral courage, I think. It's how I would describe it. He's absolutely right. They've got to keep doing it.
Now, there's over 50 pilots and observers shot down between November 15 and January 16. That is the Fokker scourge. But the Trenchard is determined to carry on. 50 is nothing compared to what would happen if one battalion's making an attack and it's shot up in no man's land. Now, you've got another quote that perhaps indicates a different side of. Would you want to read that now? That fits in well, because this is the funniest quote of all time, and it gives an insight into Trenchard's character. So I think we'll change. You can do this one, because I think you'll read about
this
them.
features in one of your books. I can't remember which one, because obviously I've read all of them. So this is Brigadier General Hugh Trenchard, and he says, I'm not going to ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. just because I'm condemned to ride about in a big Rolls Royce and sit out the fighting in a chair, you mustn't think I don't understand.
It's just awesome.
I love
Can you imagine when he says things like that in the mess? You're in the mess, your best mate's just been killed, there's a new pilot and you've just bought him a drink and trying to settle him down. And he comes in, you mustn't think I don't understand, whilst sending you off to your death next day. But that's Trenchard's job. I do not criticise Trenchard for doing his job. It's just what it is. And he's also trying to get better aircraft for 1916. You know, he knows he can't get new aircraft in 15, but he says this: until the Royal Flying Corps are in possession of a machine as good as or better than the Fokker, German Fokker, it seems that a change in the tactics employed becomes necessary. It is hoped very shortly to obtain a machine that will be able to successfully engage the Fokkers, present in use by the Germans. Oh, I misunderstood that. In the meantime, it must be laid down as a hard and fast rule that a machine proceeding on reconnaissance must be escorted by at least 3 other fighting machines. But there's 2 things about this. One, he's not backing down. Every mission still has to be carried out. It's just you're going to deploy more aircraft. And when he says fighting machines, he doesn't mean scouts. Often he just means 2 or 3 more of the same variant. Now, we've got a quote from James McCudden that tells of a reconnaissance patrol under these new rules over Valenciennes, on the 19th of December. Now, previously, a pair of machines had been sent out and they'd been shot down. And McCudden's up in the air with Lieutenant Saunders. And you tell, McCudden is a hero, but you tell the story, Gary.
I saw a long dark brown form fairly streaking across the sky. We could see that it was a German machine, and when it got above and behind our middle machine, it dived onto it for all the world like a huge hawk on a hapless sparrow. I now saw the black crosses on the underneath surface of the Fokker's wings. For a Fokker it was.
I think he's joking there.
And as it got to close range, Mr. Mealing, the pilot of this middle machine, turned and thus saved itself, although the Fokker had already hit the machine. The Fokker had by now turned and was coming towards our machine, nose on, slightly above. Not having a gun mounting to fire in that direction, I stood up with my Lewis gun to the shoulder and fired as he passed over our right wing. Now, he goes on to say that 2 or 3 times the Fokker attacked, but the formation was able to beat him off. And he says,
this is what Trenchard was meaning, that they could protect each other, even though they're not anywhere near as good as the Fokker.
So McCullen goes on to say, it was assumed that the Fokker pilot was most likely Immelman. And no doubt when we encountered him, he was waiting for the next machine that he knew we would send to get the information for which Mr. Hobbs and Mr. Tudor Jones had given their lives. But instead of finding 1 machine, he ran into 3. I was very thankful indeed to return from this outing. I had imagined that if once Immelman in his Fokker saw us, there was not much chance for us. However, we live and learn.
And that is a wonderful finishing line, isn't it? That is McCudden all over. The professional air fighter, always learning. And he would, he'd become a pilot, fire DH2s, and eventually become one of the leading aces of the Royal Flying Corps. What an amazing man. So this shows that determined pilots and observers could survive despite the Fokkers attacking them. They didn't just give up their lives. They fought. They fought to the death if necessary. They strove to overcome the faults in the aircraft they were flying to carry out their duties for the army. Because the numbers that are being lost to the Fokker scourge, they're not that big, are they? And the tabloids, then as now, they called it the Fokker scourge, But the real answer is better aircraft. They need the FE2B, the DH2, the FE8, the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter, the Newport Scout. But the spectre of the Fokker lingers for quite a while. But there weren't that many. I'll come to that. But let's just sum up, because we're near the end now. In 1915, would you say that the aircraft had been integrated into the battle plan, alongside the others? Would you say that?
Yeah, I mean, we're not at an all-arms situation, but but certainly it was an integral part of any battle planning.
Yeah, so it's joining the artillery, the infantry, and, well, they're partially sidelined, the cavalry.
The cavalry,
no.
yeah.
The BAF's grown, and the RFC has grown with it, matching in proportion its expansion. It's becoming a big organisation. No commander, no army commander, Gary, could envisage any sort of attack without full-scale photographic reconnaissance, photographic interpretation of the results, the identifying of targets to inform the tactical plans, the copious artillery observation to enable. So what you've got is the photographs identify the target. So I'm going to destroy that. And then the artillery observation enables you to hit that, even though it's out of sight from the front lines. It's behind a hill, a battery of, say, German guns. You can get at them. And then during the actual attack, they'll try and do contact patrols. But they will also engage in interdiction bombing, failed interdiction bombing usually to try. So there's many practical and theoretical difficulties still to overcome, especially in interdiction bombing and contact patrols. I'm not sure they're ever resolved in the whole of the First World War. But it's a giant step forward to the all-arms battle that's been taken here. It'll take 2 or 3... There's other things to be added, but they're on their way. Now, I think air losses are quite small. You know, I think 1950, 193, of which only 56 were killed. Now, that would be a human tragedy in many ways, or at least, you know, those figures are, by the way, from Trevor Henshaw's wonderful book, The Sky Their Battlefield. We're not the experts, are we? It's people like Trevor. You know Trevor as well. Yeah. He comes to Historians Do Drink sessions. Wonderful bloke. And his book shows it. But given the scale of what's achieved, I think it's infinitesimal compared to the casualties that could have happened on the ground. That you can have slaughter. Look what goes wrong on the Somme the first day. Absolute slaughter. So, to sum up, and I don't know what you want to say, by the end of 15, the open skies, which you could just carry your duty out on, but they were pretty empty, are now increasingly filled with aircraft carrying out their duties, and other aircraft trying to stop them and to shoot them down. It's a new tumult in the clouds, if you like. It's a new arena of war. It's a big thing, isn't it, Gary? It is big. 1915 is a crucial year.
It is, and again, I'll go back to an earlier comment. Flight had only existed, powered flight, since 1903. This is only 12 years later, and it's being used as an instrument of war.
It's amazing. And people call the aircraft primitive, but they're not, are they? They're the absolute modern technology.
They're
as far
cutting-edge technology at the time.
Well, perhaps we'll find out later what happens in 1916. I presume we stay on top to the end of the war in the air. Nothing could go wrong, unless there's an albatross around our necks, eh, Gary?
Yeah. I'd just like to point out how I feel about those nasty Eindeckers.
Those Eindeckers are swines.
What a bunch of Eindeckers.
You're an Eindecker.
On that high note, thanks very much, Pete. I'll see you next time.
Cheers, Gary. Cheers, mate.